Okay. It was published, you know, The Wasteland was published in 1922, and James Joyce, who's another really famous male modernist author, published this book called Ulysses in 1922, and it's this massive, massive, massive book that just chronicles a single day in the life of this couple of people. And so it was continued also this revolutionary new form of art. Um, and Virginia Woolf published Mrs. Dalloway in 1923, but she was working on it in 1922, and it is also the account of a single day in a life, but from an entirely different perspective. It's the story of a woman's day in a woman's life, and it also has this stream of consciousness narration style that Woolf was developing, and that we see her starting to mess around with in The Mark on the Wall and Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street. In fact, the novel Mrs. Dalloway came after Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street, and was kind of her development of that story into a novel. She wrote a letter, I think, I don't remember if it was her sister or somebody else, where she said, well, I've written Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street, and I feel like her story hasn't yet been completely told. There's more to say about Mrs. Dalloway and her life, Clarissa and her life. So the novel comes then out of Virginia Woolf's attempt to tell more of her story, which I think is really lovely. Now, we're going to focus on The Mark on the Wall today. It was first published in July of 1917, and it was her first published work of fiction. And it was published by a publishing house that she and her husband founded called the Hogarth Press. And that press, even if Virginia Woolf wasn't this amazing writer, the press itself is very important for modernism, because since a lot of what they were writing was so avant-garde and revolutionary, a lot of the traditional publishing houses wouldn't publish it. And so they made, Virginia Woolf and her husband created Hogarth Press in order to be able to publish things that wouldn't have had a place to be published otherwise. So they're really, really crucial in terms of getting work, this experimental work out there. They were the first, they published the first translation of Freud in 1901, bringing a lot of continental thought that had been very popular in France and Germany for a while, bringing it into England and by publishing it in English. And they also published works by economists. They published poetry. They published short stories and novels, but also nonfiction essays and things like, there was an economist who was a buddy of theirs, and so he would write these books about the economy, and there was biography and autobiography and memoir. So it was just really this eclectic kind of writing that they were publishing, and they did it by hand. They had this one printing press, and they would set it and print it by hand. And in fact, they had to take a break from the press because where they lived was in danger of being bombed by the Germans during the war. And one time a bomb did hit their house, and it destroyed the press. And so they weren't able to continue publishing the work of these other modernists until they were able to replace it. And it was safe to do so. And it was a tragedy because a lot of original manuscripts were also destroyed in that bombing, which is another, you know, it's not obviously the same as losing the life of someone, but it's also a certain kind of cultural loss to lose these works of literature that were becoming so important and were really changing literature out of the modes that had been common during the Victorian period. So it's another loss in addition to all the great losses of the war. So I think I mentioned last time about how The Mark on the Wall is stream of consciousness. And we might find that less revolutionary now, but at the time people were like, what is going on? And it challenged so much about what people assumed a novel or a short story should be or what it does. So if I ask you, and not if I ask you, so I mean, what do you think the story is about? Like if someone told you, if you told someone, oh, I'm reading The Mark on the Wall, and they said, well, what is that story about? What would you say? Anyone? I mean, I think it's a simple question, but a really impossible question at the same time, right? So what would you say the story is about?
I think I'd say,
Oh, we lost you. We lost your audio.
it's about a woman who notices something on the wall and then goes down infinite rabbit trails from there.
Yeah, that sounds about right. What else? What else would you say it's about? I mean, you might say it's a meditation on life and death, because one of the rabbit trails has to do with what happens when we die and what it's in heaven and are we reincarnated. So it could be about that or one of the other philosophical concerns that she addresses. Um, it could be about a mark on the wall that turns out to be a snail, right? Like there's all kinds of ways we could describe what this story is about. And even in the way Annie put it, like all infinite rabbit trails, usually when we think about a short story, we think in terms of like plot, right? Not in terms of like sort of philosophical content, or maybe that's not what we first go to. But when we say, what is a story about? Like we often think about, well, what is the plot of the story? And so when we say, what is the mark of the wall about? Like anything that we could say somehow feels kind of unsatisfactory, right? Like it doesn't really get at what the story is about. And I think part of that is because there's no plot per se. If we think of the traditional definition of plot, plot is simply a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it has like this kind of curved trajectory. So the beginning builds up toward a crisis, there's a resolution of the crisis, and then there's a coming back down of the crisis. And we don't really get that in this story because essentially it's just a woman sitting in a chair and looking at a mark on a wall. We don't particularly see character development. We don't see any kind of sudden intrusion that interrupts her thinking about the mark on the wall. We don't really have, there's one other character that shows up in the very end, but that character isn't fully developed in any kind of way. And we don't really see the woman interacting with that character. So all of the normal traditional ways we would describe a story just aren't here. And so that makes it in some ways very revolutionary because it makes it part of the project that a lot of modernist writers had in sort of trying to do new things with how we think about what a story is and what defines a story. So how about this? How does it feel, if it does at all, how does it feel similar to The Wasteland? Like what things does it kind of share or have in common? Or if it does? Do you feel like it resonated or had a similar vibe, or what kinds of things seem like they both had in common?
One thing in common was I had no idea where either of them were going the whole time I was
Yeah.
reading either of them.
Yes, I totally agree. Again, we lack that beginning, middle, and an end that kind of pulls us forward. What else? What else seems similar? Come on, we can do more than that, right? Annie's like carried the weight of discussion twice already, so let's like throw in, what are some other ways in which it might be similar?
I mean, there are some allusions to like history and like outside events.
Yeah, so there's a similar technique being employed, which would be it's highly elusive. Maybe not as elusive as The Wasteland, because The Wasteland is like, it is illusion, but it makes allusions to outside events and historical texts and so forth. So yeah, it's like it in that way. Anything else? We've talked about its lack of a clear plot. We've talked about technique that's similar. Is there anything else that feels similar or sort of like they're in the same family?
This kind of goes with like the lack of plot, but it just feels like really fragmented,
Mm-hmm.
like The Wasteland did, because you don't really like know what's like what she's gonna say next. She kind of like
Yeah.
goes back and forth between points.
And there's no like transitions that make sense. It's just here's something, here's an idea, here's an idea. And for me, it kind of feels like Woolf could have organized the, you know how she'll think, oh, what if it's a leaf, and then she has a digression. What if it's a nail, and she has a digression. It just feels like she could have put those digressions in any order, and it might not have made too much of a difference in terms of how we understood it. And I think some of the themes are similar. There's a lot of musing on existential concerns and anxieties. There's, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but the person who sort of bursts in at the end mentions the war, and there's stuff that has to do with the war. So things about life and death and loss, and that's very similar to The Wasteland. And I would say too that one of the things that's really unique about this story is the fact that it is written, it never specifically says that this is a woman who's the main character, but we all kind of intuitively know it is, because at one point she says like, oh, I'm not a good housekeeper. And we know that usually it's the women who are going to be dusting the furniture and stuff. So by implication, we assume that this is a woman. And we didn't get, well, we just don't know if we got a particular woman as a character who was musing about life and death in the same way we did in The Wasteland. So it's a particularly feminine and even feminist version of the kinds of questioning that The Wasteland brings up. And I say feminist because Virginia Woolf is also very well known for being a very, very committed feminist, a deeply committed pacifist. There's a lot of her writing, especially a story, or not a story, a series of essays called A Room of One's Own, in which she tries to imagine, would it have been possible for women to have been some of the big names in the canon? So she imagines, suppose Shakespeare had a sister, Judith Shakespeare, she was just as talented as he was. Would it have been possible for her to have the same kind of fame that he did? And she reasons through and says, well, no, there's no way that an equally talented female Shakespeare could have ever achieved the success that William Shakespeare did, precisely because she's a woman. And all of the expectations about gender that we place on women, especially at the time when Shakespeare was writing, would have utterly prevented her from being able to be successful. So Virginia Woolf was very much committed to how can women have places and resources in order to write. So very much a feminist, and I think a lot of her feminist critiques of the world and language comes out pretty strongly in The Mark on the Wall, and we'll talk about that in a minute. One thing I think we can say about it is it's pretty experimental. If you think about modernist literature, one of the key features we talk about is how it destabilizes narrative. So if you think about Dickens' A Christmas Carol, that's a very stable narrative. It's got a beginning, a middle, and end. It's a redemption arc. We have very clearly defined characters. There's a moral lesson. Like, that's a traditional stable narrative. It's chronological, events happen chronologically. We have reliable narrators for the most part. And we just don't get that in The Mark on the Wall. And in fact, Woolf's work are often taken to be kind of illustrative of like a revolution in 20th century literature, especially since she was publishing early on. And she's also really connected to this like revolution in 20th century literature because she was a really good, letter writer and diarist. So she wrote a lot about what she was trying to achieve in her fiction writing. And so she thought a lot about like, well, how can I write something that doesn't do this? How can I write something that would convey this? And she was very thoughtful of experiments that she was trying to do. So it's really interesting to even read what she's thinking as she's writing something like The Mark on the Wall or Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street. And people really emphasize her sort of revolutionary treatment of time and space and stream of consciousness narrative style, and her interest in how our past is always interwoven into the present. And this story, The Mark on the Wall, we could define as a woman sitting in a room smoking a cigarette and thinking about a mark on the wall and all of her digressions. But a lot of people will also talk about it's about this sort of a philosophical discussion on the connection between thought and external reality. So like how a consciousness understands the world and the object it's trying to understand. So there's a lot of that going on too. And so that's kind of like a different feeling than like a Christmas Carol. Like we don't really think of a Christmas Carol about being deep existential thought. Like we could probably push it that way, but it would be a little anachronistic to demand that it be a philosophical interrogation of the connection between thought and external reality. Like that doesn't feel very Victorian. But I think we can say that it's more than just about experimentation and style. But there's a lot more going on to it that's really important. And so I think one way to get at that question about what is interesting about it is to think about the end and the startling conclusion that the mark on the wall is a snail. How many people were just kind of like floored by that? Like, what? It's a snail? Like that, just every time I read it, I was just like, you gotta be kidding me. It was a snail? And it makes me imagine, like, how did the snail get there? Like she had said she thought the mark on the wall had been there since January. So like, was the snail there since January? Or is she just like totally confused and she thought she had seen it in January, but she really didn't? And like, is it crawling or is it like dead? Or like, how did it get, all these kinds of things. It's like a snail. And I think we're kind of supposed to be really concerned about the snail and confused. And if you think about snails, they have like spirally shells, and the way her thinking process goes is very spirally and so forth. So in some ways, a snail is like sort of the perfect little metaphor for the story. But I think what we forget is that we discover that it's a snail in the context of this outburst. So if you go ahead and turn to the very last page, the very end of the story. I mean, the narrator is really on a kick now about getting like really diffuse or whatever. She says, where was I? What has it all been about? A tree, a river, the downs, Whitaker's Almanac, the fields of asphodel? I can't remember a thing. Everything moving, falling, slipping, vanishing, ... There is a vast upheaval of matter. Someone is standing over me and saying, and then all of a sudden somebody really is standing over her and saying, I'm going to buy a newspaper. Yes? Though it's no good buying newspapers. Nothing ever happens. Curse the war. God damn the war. All the same, I don't see why we should have a snail on our wall. Ah, the mark on the wall. It was a snail. But notice, curse the war. God damn the war. Nothing ever happens. The main character and the reader, at the same time we discover that the mark is a snail, it occurs in this outburst of a reference to World War I. And I think that discovery causes us to rethink the whole narrative retrospectively. Now we can't help but think, wait, does it matter that it was a snail? And what does it mean that it's nothing ever happens, there's no good in buying newspapers, curse the war, and all the same, nevertheless, cursing the war, I don't see why we should have a snail on our wall. Like all the same suggests some kind of logical connection between the two things, between the World War I and the snail. And so in order to try to figure out what the heck that connection might be, we find ourselves rethinking the whole story. Like, were there any clues that we missed? Was there any information that might like make more sense of this? And I think that it's not until the war is mentioned in that final exchange that we can start to pick out elements about the war that preceded it. So things like retired colonels who collect arrowheads somehow seem now like a more weighty reference, or the military valence of the word generalization, and she talks about that word. And then the point where she wishes that on a winter's night, nothing tender might be exposed to iron bullets. Like all those kinds of things suddenly seem more weighty than they did before if we reread it, knowing in advance this reference to the war. And so you might say, or at least what I'm going to argue, is that it turns out that this is the story of someone who's trying and only is partially successful, trying not to think about the war. Like that's what this piece is about, someone trying not to think about the war. And I think that's really important because if we consider this a kind of war literature, and I find it really interesting that a lot of, like, if you look at other universities and schools where they have like war literature classes, they'll include the Mark on the Wall along with their war poets and novels and so forth. And so I think it's really interesting to think of this as a story about World War I, because it gives us a perspective on the impact of the war on civilians and the impact on everyday life of civilians. And I think that gives us another indication of just how far, how encompassing, how total World War I was, so that it infiltrates, it's insidious, it sort of shows up in all like aspects of life, even civilians sitting in chairs trying not to think about the wall by focusing on something like this mysterious mark. So one question for us then is, okay, what would Woolf's contemporary readers have thought about the narrative in retrospect? So if it was published in 1917, would it have been more likely that the readers would have picked up on those references to World War I from the get-go? And I think, oh, my cat is just meowing because she wants to come in. Oh, she's so cute. Anyway, I think it's probably true that a lot of the contemporary readers would have picked up more directly on references to the war. So let's think a little bit about the context in which the story was published. I said already that Virginia Woolf was a well-known pacifist and a feminist. And she was really critical of what she saw as the way men think, and how that kind of thought and thought processing and logic was implicated in supporting certain political positions and enabled the move to and justifications of war. So she felt that it was a particular kind of masculine thinking, that's the term she uses, masculine thinking, that leads us to war. And in terms of like the specific historical context, because it was written in 1917, Woolf had firsthand knowledge of the impact of World War I. She was friends with Rupert Brooke, who died in 1915, and she wrote a lot in letters and journals, things like, what would he have been? What would he have done? And she really thinks a lot about like what his life could have been had it not been cut short by the war. In 1916, her husband like narrowly escaped being drafted, which was a very traumatic experience for her. She wrote in a letter in June 1916, "The war is a nightmare, isn't it? 2 cousins of mine were killed this last week, and I suppose in other families it's much worse." And then in 1917, her 2 brothers-in-law died in the war. So she had direct experience, not to mention the fact that where she lived was in danger of being bombed by Germans and so forth. So she was really horrified by the huge numbers of deaths in the space of just a few years. And it's only 1917. And Woolf probably had every reason in her writing, given the kind of writer she was, to really problematize the current political system, situation that was going on. Like, it makes a lot of sense, given her commitments to feminism and to pacifism, that she would be writing literature that really was trying to problematize or be critical of or offer different perspectives of the experience of World War I. So some other kind of places that we see that coming up is that she often wrote and complained that women's views on wars were forced into the background because there's no way any woman could possibly understand anything about war. So she felt like women's voices were marginalized by men during war. She found that the male justifications and the legitimation of war and patriotic sentiment was revolting, because she wrote, "Wars and ministries and legislations were invented presumably by gentlemen who wished to dignify mankind at all costs." So she was very disdainful of like the idea that generals thought that they were pursuing a noble war for the good of all mankind. And ultimately, she linked this kind of justifications and these acts of legitimation to rigid binary thinking and sort of what she called the cult of order. So she really thought that rigid binary thinking and kind of this like burning desire for order at all cost was the kind of thinking that ultimately produces and leads us to war and violences of various kinds. And she was she saw that kind of thinking as being very prominent in the Victorian era, and also in sort of what she called the masculine world, because she thought the masculine world tend to see things in terms of hierarchies and norms. So if we take all that stuff and we rethink the story and we ask, has it all been about war? I do think the themes, those critiques I just mentioned about masculine positions and so forth, really do kind of get worked out and chewed on in The Mark on the Wall. And so what I'm going to try to argue for us is that The Mark on the Wall is this story about someone trying not to think about the war and failing. And it's also about the experience of war from the perspective of civilians and civilian mental life. So we could talk about the impact of the war on civilian life in terms of rationing, or loved ones going to the front, or propaganda urging them to support the war through volunteer work or whatever. So that's kind of like physical life. But this is looking at how the war impacts civilian mental life and ways of thinking. And so ultimately, I think it's about how the war takes over everything, like every little thing, that there's no way to escape it. And I found that this was like kind of a particularly appropriate time to be reading about a person trying not to think about something that is all encompassing, because I feel like that's kind of our current moment. Like concerns about this current pandemic is like how can you not think about it? And even it takes energy to try not to think about it and to somehow pursue like your normal day-to-day activities and so forth. And there's something very weighty and exhausting about trying not to think about something that is everywhere and in everything. So kind of I thought was interesting to read it in this context. And I think that my argument that it's about someone trying not to think about the war is really an interesting argument, because part of the problem that Woolf sets for herself is how can you be critical of the logic and language and binary thinking and order that leads to war and supports war if you are using that same kind of logic and language itself. So how can she be critical of the logic and language and binary thinking that supports war without also using logic and language and binary thinking? And I think one really clear example of that is just simply, we never know what's going on. Like, it's not a logical binary piece. It meanders and it goes off on what we consider to be rabbit holes and tangents. So it's like kind of subordinating things differently. Like normally, if we say something is a rabbit trail or a tangent, it's because we recognize that there's a main thrust of the narrative or the thinking, and there's these side things that are actually unimportant. And so it's a rabbit trail because you're spending too much time on unimportant things. But she kind of flips that. So the things that are normally considered unimportant become the main body of the whole piece. So she's flipping these hierarchies and values that organize the way traditional novels work. And so I think that's pretty fascinating. And it's tricky. How can you write a critique of binary and rigid thinking, not using binary and rigid thinking, and have people be able to recognize what you're doing, right? Because there seems like that gets to a point where you could say she's being so circuitous and so self-reflective and so non-linear that the critique about binary thinking, like we can't even see it anymore. Like we get lost in it. And so I think that's like part of her challenge that she's trying to do. Another thing I really think is interesting about considering this as like a war story or a story embedded in war is that it's a real stark contrast to either the patriotic war literature of the time, like Rupert Brooke's The Soldier, and it's also very different from the cynical war literature of the time. So like Wilfred Owen's Dulce Decor and Est and other trench poetry. So it's a very unique response to the war. It's a woman's response to the war. It's a civilian's response to the war, and it's a civilian's mental life in response to the war. And I think, as I said, that the sort of plotlessness and the sort of anti-structure that embodies the story is like really emblematic of her resistance against binary thinking and what she calls masculine logic. All right. So you may be asking yourself, Professor Williams, are you reading too much into this story? And the answer is no. I'm not, just, I have the PhD and you, no, just kidding. I'm really not, I don't think I am. I think the story itself gives us a little lesson on how to read it, and kind of gives us, authorizes us to read the story in particular ways that we might not tend to use when we're interpreting a traditional narrative. So let's look on page 84. And the main character gives us like this little metaphor that kind of, I think, provides like a key to the logic of how the text works. Is that what I really mean? Hold on, hold on. Oh, I actually meant 83. All right, so in the second paragraph on page 83, the narrator says, how readily our thoughts swarm upon a new object, lifting it a little way as ants carry a blade of straw so feverishly and then leave it. And I think that kind of is this way in which she's telling us how we can see this story. This is the story of how somebody lifts this new object, which is the mark on the wall, lifting it a little ways and then carrying it so feverishly only to leave it and then move on to a new idea. I think that's an indication that tells us that that mark on the wall and the way in which it spreads out into new kinds of thinking is a legitimate way to interpret the novel. It's legitimate to sort of look at those rabbit trails themselves. And as you know, each proposal of what the mark could be, it's a nail, it's a smudge, it's a rose leaf, always set her off on a new topic of thinking. So each time she gives the mark new meaning, like the mark is this, it directs her toward a whole new set of ideas. So for example, the narrator's first guess is that the mark is made by a nail, and that leads her to this sort of vigorous critique of Victorian culture that's sort of exemplified by the kind of furniture and art you would hang on the wall. So it's a nail on the wall, which is kind of this image of things that are nailed down. And that leads her to do a critique of the Victorian culture that's all about rigid order and binary thinking. Or following that, she thinks that the mark is caused by some round black substance, and perhaps the legacy of a small rose leaf. And this prompts the narrator to see everything will soon turn to dust. So in the same way that the rose leaf decayed and left a mark, so too does everything like decay and leave a mark or turn into dust. And so that's what the narrator's doing. And we do the same thing. We learn that the mark is a snail in the context of this outburst about war. And then this idea prompts us to see all kinds of subtle references and allusions to war in general. So the nail leads her to a critique of Victorian nailed down logic. The smudge, the decayed rose leaf, leads her to think about life and death and everything decaying. A mark that's actually a snail connected to World War I causes us now to think about all kinds of allusions to war in general and World War I in particular that are in the story. So the story itself is working that way, and I think that authorizes us to interpret that way. Like we're allowed to think that way too. And I think too, like I really want to stress, it may seem inconsequential to say, oh, it's a snail. in the middle of this outburst on the war. But I think what Woolf's doing is she's really trying to tie those together. She does it linguistically by having them appear in the same little conversation, but even logically by using the all the same. So all the same is this phrase that implies connection. So what she's done here is she's tied together the war with a snail that's on a wall. And that's, I think, what authorizes us now to now start thinking about allusions to the war and warfare in general. And it's even more experience that I think that the fact that the war is the mark on the wall is a snail is even more evidence that our whole lives during the war is saturated with thinking about the war. So something as small as a snail that really doesn't have anything to do about war is made to be about war by the person who says, curse the war, goddamn the war, all the same, why do we have a snail on the wall? That person is making the snail be about war. All right. So then what are these war references? And I think that you know what I think is ironic? Like it's a snail, right? And then the first thing she thinks it could be a nail, but like snails are like the most fragile, like in danger of being like pierced and crushed like by nails or something like that, of anything. So it's just kind of funny to me that her first thought is it must be a nail, because like that's like the anti-snail actually. Did you ever do those, put salt on them when you were little? Oh, we were just vicious, vicious children. We would put salt on them and they kind of bubble and dissolve. And now I'm like, those poor snails. Oh, we thought it was great. It's like people who like burn the ant with the magnifying glass. I didn't do that at least, but I put salt on snails. Oh, terrible children. Children are cruel. All right, so let's look at some of these war references. So I'll start with a small example, and that's the rose leaf. And that is on page 84 and 85. So at the second to last paragraph on that page on 84, she says, and yet the mark on the wall, and remember too, every time she talks about it, she's like, well, I could get up and look, but then she never does. She's always like, well, but certainty is overrated, so it doesn't even matter. Anyway, and yet the mark on the wall is not a hole at all. It may even be caused by some round black substance, such as a small rose leaf left over from the summer, and I, not being a very vigilant housekeeper, look at the dust on the mantelpiece, for example, the dust which, so they say, buried Troy 3 times over, only fragments of pots utterly refusing annihilation, as one can believe. So Troy is all about the Trojan War, right? And the reason why it's buried in dust is because in literature, it seems as if Troy was destroyed 3 times, and that the only thing that left are these little fragments of pots. Because war destroys stuff. So in the same way that there's only this little smudge of a leaf left, that's like how during war, a city can be destroyed and the only thing left are broken fragments of stuff. So now the rose leaf on the wall becomes an allusion to war, because it's about Troy and it's about the Trojan War in a place that's been destroyed 3 times by invaders. So that's a small example of how we can read or see more legibly references to the war than we did before. Here's another small example, and this is at the very last sentences on page 83 going on to 84. Oh, I guess I jumped ahead of myself. This is when she says, like, I could get up. So at the very bottom of the page, on page 83, the first page. But as for the mark, I'm not sure about it. I don't believe it was made by a nail after all. It's too big, too round for that. I might get up, but if I got up and looked at it 10 to 1, I shouldn't be able to say for certain, because once a thing's done, no one ever knows how it happened. Oh, dear me, the mystery of life, the inaccuracy of thought, the ignorance of humanity. And she talks in a couple of places about a distrust of certifying what has happened. In an essay that she wrote that isn't published in the Mark on the Wall, obviously, she wrote, the history of the war is not and never will be written from our point of view because no one who has taken stock of his own impressions since August 4th, 1914, can possibly believe that history as it is written closely resembles history as it is lived. But as we are, for the most part, quiescent and, if skeptical ourselves, content to believe that what the rest of mankind believes, we have no right to complain if we are fobbed off once more with historians' histories. So she's saying here that if you think about your own impressions of the war, even if you verified what actually happened in a history book, everybody knows that what actually happened in the history book is different from what you have experienced yourself. So there's a real way in which we can't trust, we can't verify things fully. We can never really say the war was caused because of or by this. Like, we'll never be able to do that. And we'll never be able to sufficiently interpret the war in such a way that it becomes like this neat package. Like, this is about World War I, and then it encompasses everything. There are just things we can't know, and we can't do this, like, you know, beautifully encapsulated version. All right, here's a bigger example of the way in which allusions to war work now that we know that they can be there. If you look on page 85, she imagines seeing Shakespeare. She says at the top of 85, I want to think quietly, calmly, spaciously, never to be interrupted, never to have to rise from my chair, to slip easily from one thing to another without any sense of hostility or obstacle. That's essentially what she's doing, right? I want to sink deeper and deeper away from the surface with its hard, separate facts, to steady myself. Let me catch hold of the first idea that passes. Shakespeare. Well, he will do as well as another, a man who sat himself solidly in an armchair and looked into the fire so a shower of ideas fell perpetually from some very high heaven looking down through his mind. He leant his forehead on one hand, and people looking in through the open door, for this scene is supposed to have taken place on a summer's evening. But how dull this is, this historical fact. It doesn't interest me at all. So she's talking about how this sort of historical narration of facts, here is Shakespeare writing an amazing work, and he sat in that chair right there. Wow, look at that chair. You too could sit in this chair where he wrote Romeo and Juliet. Like, this is just this boring historical facts, this historical fiction. And if you think about Shakespeare, he wrote a lot of plays that were historical fiction. So we have all of the plays that are about different kings in England, and they're all historical fiction. And she says, well, I want to tell stories differently. So if you go down a bit on page 85 to the next paragraph, she says, these are the kinds of thoughts that I want to have. And then I came into the room. They were discussing botany. I said how I'd seen a flower growing on a dust heap at the side of an old house in Kingsway. The seed, I said, must have been sown in the reign of Charles I. What flowers grew in the reign of Charles I, I asked, but I don't remember the answer. Tall flowers with purple tassels to them, and so it goes on. All the time I'm dressing up the figure of myself in my own mind, lovingly, stealthily, not openly adoring it, for if I did, I should catch myself out and stretch my hand at once for a book in self-protection. So in the same way that Shakespeare would write stories about kings, I don't think he was alive for the reign of Charles I. He certainly wasn't for Charles II. By saying, oh, I saw a flower growing over there, it must have been planted in the reign of Charles I. Now she's telling a historical fiction too, only from quite a different perspective. Like here, it's the flower that sets off the chain of thinking about Charles I and his reign. She says that it's what kind of flowers grew, tall flowers with purple tassels on them, perhaps. People think that that could be a reference to lavender. because you know how a lavender spike has kind of little blossoms like this, like a tassel. And we know that King Charles's mistress, her favorite flower was lavender. So a whole story about the reign of King Charles I can be spun out through contemplating a flower. And that would be a different kind of historical fiction than the kind that Shakespeare wrote. And not only that, like when we're talking about kings and reigns, like that always has an association with military and with conquest, because that's what kings and reigns are all about. They're all about conquering places and legal succession between fathers and sons and so forth. Okay, and now let's look at a big example. This is on page 86. And this one here is a direct reference to World War I. And it's one that her readers, I'm sure, would have caught, but that we probably don't. All righty. So go down to the last paragraph on the page, on page 86. In certain lights, that mark on the wall seems actually to project from the wall, nor is it entirely circular. I cannot be sure, but it seems to cast a perceptible shadow, suggesting that if I ran my finger down the strip of the wall, it would, at a certain point, mount and descend a small tumulus. Like she could just get up and verify it, yet she doesn't. A smooth tumulus like those barrows on the South Downs, which are, they say, either tombs or camps. Of the two, I should prefer them to be tombs, desiring melancholy like most English people, and find it natural at the end of the walk to think of the bones stretched beneath the turf. There must be some book about it. Some antiquary must have dug up those bones and given them a name. What sort of man is an antiquary, I wondered. Retired colonels for the most part, I dare say, leading parties of aged laborers to the top here, examining, clods of earth and stone, and getting into correspondence with the neighboring clergy, and so forth and so on. And it goes down a bit. The colonel himself feels agreeably philosophic in accumulating evidence on both sides of the question. It is true he does finally incline to believe in the camp, and being imposed, indicts a pamphlet which he is about to read at the quarterly meeting of the local society, when a stroke lays him low and his last conscious thoughts are not of wife or child, but of the camp and that arrowhead there, which is now in the case at the local museum. And so forth. Now, Southern Downs or South Downs, in 1916, Woolf wrote an article called Heard on the Downs, The Genesis of Myth. And she wrote that article for a newspaper, and it was about how close the South Downs are to the battlefields in France. So this is what she wrote. She wrote that two well-known writers were describing the sound of guns in France as they heard it from the top of South Downs. So she's pointing out how in that particular place, if you're at the top of the Downs, you can hear the guns of World War I in France. All walks on the Downs that this summer are accompanied by the sinister sound of far-off beating, which is sometimes as faint as the ghost of an echo, and sometimes rises almost from the next fold of the gray land. So the war is this kind of sinister sound, a far-off beating that is like a ghost of an echo that is just beating and haunting everybody who lives in South Downs, their everyday life. And she also notes in this essay that South Downs has always been a military area where trench warfare is not unknown. So she writes, not so very long ago, we say 100 years at most, England was invaded, and the enemy landing on the down at the back of our village, we dug trenches to withstand him, much like those in Flanders now. You may see them with your own eyes. And this somehow is proof that if the Germans land, they will land here, which although terrifying, also gratifies our own sense of importance. And although war never did take place, World War I never did go as far as South Downs, She writes that the raids and rationing and German prisoners walking on the downs had become a part of life in 1917. So when she references the South Downs, and how there are these places, these barrows on South Downs that are either tombs or camps, the word camp there means military camp. And so she's making this association with South Downs that everybody would have been familiar with as these places where you can hear World War I happening and where German prisoners of war were always walking past, and where the people who lived in South Downs were always having to worry about raids, and they had to ration, and all that kind of stuff was a part of life in 1917. So the mark of the wall, in the mark on the wall, what we have is this kind of a moment where we see the dichotomy of war and peace. So in the form of tombs and camps. So tombs are something that happen after war because the soldiers have died, versus camps, which is what we have when the war is still going on. And so she talks about how some people, the antiquaries, who are actually retired colonels, have a great interest in digging up bones and tombs and giving them names. And so we can only kind of guess that these retired colonels stand in for politicians and cabinet ministries who, after the war, it was their job to commemorate the dead and honor their names. So South Downs becomes like a really, really powerful and dense allusion to war and also politics, and also to this idea that you have camps when the men are fighting, then you have tombs of the fallen soldiers when they're dead, and the colonels are involved in both of them. The colonels are active during the war in the camps, and then they're active when they're retired colonels taking care to commemorate and honor the dead, which of course they have a stake in doing because they want to justify the fact that these men died in the first place. So of course they're going to commemorate them as fallen heroes, because that supports the kind of thinking that they used that put people in the war in the first place. Anyway, I don't know, what do you think? That was kind of like me babbling a whole lot. I think I got so worked up I even spit a little bit at one point, so maybe you didn't notice, now you know. But I'm going to drink some coffee a little bit while you process. And just tell me a little bit, like, does it feel like, oh, I kind of do feel like there might be stuff that I would notice about the war, or it could be frustrating because like I didn't know about South Downs, I only know it because of my research. So is this like a kind of narrative style that only really works if someone is alive in 1917 or like really shortly after the wall? Does it mean that the story kind of has like an expiration date? You know what I mean?
I feel like it would be unfair to say that any piece of literature has like an expiration date. Like I think we can always pull elements of literature out, you know, into contemporary times and compare them generationally. But I think in terms of her writing, it seems fitting to say that it would be geared towards a specific audience, especially because it's so heavily modernist. I think that I mean that seems like it was really one of the biggest initiatives of modernism, was to create some form of literary movement that spoke to an audience that was experiencing something unprecedented. And I think that it achieves that in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Well, we talked a little bit about this in the other class, the idea of representational strategies. And that idea is just like when the war starts, what we have are representational strategies from the Victorian period. So we know how to write realistic novels, or we know how to write poetry in a certain way. But then as the war goes on, and that's why you could say some of the trench poems at the beginning of the war seem a lot more traditional. and seem less experimental. But then as we experience war, we realize that the world is not what we thought. And the world is not a place of logic and order, because war is not about logic and order. And so the strategies you used to write literature before, they don't work. Those strategies were meant to work when things were logical and in order. And so new ways of writing literature to express the human condition had to be developed that would work when things are not logical and ordered. So kind of the form and the experimentalism of modernist literature could be a direct result of the fact that the human experience was fragmented and completely different from everything that had gone before. And so modernist literature has to be completely different from everything that had gone on before. Like, that makes sense that it would be. And so from that perspective, if what Woolf's trying to do is to capture a certain way of thinking of someone living in 1917 and experiencing World War I, like, we can certainly use research to sort of get at what that way of thinking might be. But we might also without that research, it might be harder for us to see things like references to war that would have been like very, very obvious to readers in 1917. And that's not to say that it's no good as literature, like you say, Rachel. Like, I don't think we need to say now it doesn't have any use, because even I was thinking about the coronavirus as I was reading it, and thinking about the process of trying not to think about something that you can't help but think about. So yeah. Was there someone else that wanted to say something? And I thought I saw a little flicker on the participant bar. There's like a little flash if someone's going to say something. So I thought I maybe saw one. All right, well, let's like leave it for now. And I have a few more comments to say about masculine thinking, and the way some of the writing she said about masculine thinking elsewhere, and where we see that in particular coming up. I don't have a ton of comments to say about it, but I just don't want to rush it and have us have a super long class today. So I'll pick up by talking about masculine thinking and where it shows up in the Mark on the Wall. And then the rest of class will be about Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street. And what we're going to try to do with Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street is a similar thing of trying to locate references to World War I. And some of this requires historic research, which I'm going to share with you, but others of it I think is a lot more, if you start thinking through it, a lot more obvious than it might first appear. So if you haven't read Mrs. Dalloway on Bond Street yet, as you're reading, kind of think about references to war and World War I. And then if you already did read it and have some time to review it, you could do the same thing. And we'll focus on World War I in that piece as well. Okay, thank you, the 9 of you. It's a small class. That means on Thursday it's going to be big, right? Anyway, so you are welcome to be involved with Thursday's class, or you can watch the recording once it's up. Oh, and remember that paper 2, the modernism paper, is due on Thursday, May 7th. If you want to talk about that, bounce ideas. I've had a couple people email to bounce ideas. That's totally great. I'm happy to do that. And gosh, yep, the 7th and then the 12th. So we're getting there. It's like I want it to be done, but it's going to be so painful. Like, you know what I mean? Anyway, all right. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day. The sun's coming out, so go sit in the sun.
Thanks, Professor.